In 1969, an NVA medic named Hoa opened a captured American aid bag on a dirt floor. She expected to find bandages. She found instead more medical material than her own field hospitals sometimes had for an entire week. She had trained for 2 years to become a medic, learning her craft the way her whole side had to learn everything through scarcity, improvisation, and an unrelenting discipline about waste. She boiled and reused bandages until the cloth wore thin. She stretched a single vial of antiseptic across more patients than it was ever meant to treat. She had learned to save everything, because saving was the only thing standing between her patients and having nothing at all. The bag in front of her belonged to an American medic killed in an ambush 2 days earlier. It had been carried back to her position intact, its owner's blood still dried on the canvas strap. She unzipped the first compartment, expecting to find, at best, a slightly better version of her own meager kit. What she found instead was a dressing individually sealed in its own waterproof wrapper, sterile, untouched, one of many identical dressings packed in a row, each one meant to be used exactly once and thrown away. She had never in her life discarded a usable bandage. She stared at that first wrapper for a long moment before she opened the second compartment and found the same abundance waiting there, too. Hoa could not know the name of the American medic who had carried that bag, or what his own final minutes had been like. She knew only that she was holding in 2 hands more sterile material than her hospital sometimes possessed for an entire ward, carried casually on the back of a single man, treated as ordinary equipment rather than precious cargo. That is the story of the moment a field medic trained her whole career in scarcity, opened a bag, and found a level of wealth she had no framework at all for understanding. Now, let me show you exactly what stunned her, item by item. If a story like this matters to you, if the men and women who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a simple bag of bandages could stun a trained medic this completely, you first have to understand exactly what medicine looked like on her own side of that war. To understand Hoa's astonishment, you first have to understand the world she actually practiced medicine in. It was built entirely around a scarcity so complete that almost nothing in her training assumed abundance in any form. North Vietnam's medical supply chain depended heavily on aid from allies, moved down the same dangerous roads and trails that carried every other kind of material south under the same constant threat of interdiction that made every shipment uncertain. Medical supplies competed for space on the same trucks, carrying ammunition and food, and they arrived, when they arrived at all, in quantities that had to be stretched across far more patients than they were ever meant to serve. A single roll of gauze might dress a dozen wounds before it was finally exhausted, reused and reboiled between patients because there was no realistic alternative. Antiseptic was diluted further than any manual would have recommended, because diluted antiseptic that reached more patients was better than concentrated antiseptic that reached only a few. Picture the actual routine of Hoa's workday, because the scarcity was not an occasional inconvenience. It was the texture of everything she did. Each morning began with an inventory, what remained from yesterday, what had been boiled clean overnight and could be pressed back into service, what was simply gone and would not be replaced until the next uncertain shipment arrived. She learned to read a wound not only for what it needed, but for what she could actually afford to give it, a calculation that ran silently under every single decision she made all day, every day, for years. Consider what a genuinely bad week looked like, because those weeks were common rather than exceptional. A supply convoy delayed by an airstrike somewhere along the trail, its cargo either destroyed or simply late by days that felt much longer to the people waiting for it. A sudden spike in casualties from an operation nobody had warned her hospital to prepare for. Hua, working through her dwindling stock, watching the number she tracked in her head grow smaller with every patient, forced into the specific, terrible arithmetic of deciding which wound absolutely required a fresh dressing and which one could make do with something already used twice before. There was no supervisor to appeal to for more. There was only the stock in front of her and the patient still waiting, and the quiet, constant work of making an impossible math problem come out as well as it possibly could. The scarcity shaped the entire practice of medicine on Hoa's side, down to the most basic habits of her daily work. She learned to save everything that could conceivably be saved. Used bandages were washed, boiled, and returned to service rather than discarded, a practice that would have horrified an American medic trained in strict sterile technique, but one that reflected a simple, unavoidable calculation. A slightly less sterile bandage that existed was better than a perfectly sterile one that did not. Needles were reused far more than any hygiene standard would recommend, sharpened by hand when they grew dull, because a used needle was still a needle, and a needle thrown away was gone forever. And this scarcity was not simply an inconvenience, it had real and measurable costs. Paid in patients Hoa could not save with the tools available to her in infections that spread, because sterile supplies simply did not exist in the quantities needed to prevent them. She had become, through years of this practice, remarkably skilled at achieving results with almost nothing, a genuine, hard-won expertise in medicine under total deprivation that deserves real respect. But it also meant her entire understanding of what medical practice required was built around a world where abundance simply did not exist as a concept she had any practical experience with at all. Now walk through what Hoa actually found inside that bag, item by item, because each discovery taught her something distinct, and together they built the full shape of her astonishment. The dressings came first, and they were the detail that stopped her longest. Individually wrapped, each one sealed in its own waterproof packaging, sterile until the moment it was actually needed, and designed from the outset to be used exactly once and discarded. In Hoa's world, a dressing was an object with a long working life, cleaned and returned to service again and again until the fabric itself finally gave out. Here was a dressing built with the explicit assumption that it would be thrown away after a single use, an assumption that only made sense if you had enough dressings behind it to make that kind of waste completely unremarkable. She counted them, out of habit, more than anything else, and stopped counting when the number made the whole exercise feel absurd. Picture her hands actually moving through the compartment, because the physical act of it mattered as much as the count. Each wrapper crinkled the same way, factory sealed, none of them patched or mended or showing the soft worn edges of cloth that had been boiled a dozen times. She turned one over, looking for some sign of use, some indication that this particular dressing had already served another patient and been cleaned for reuse. There was none. It was simply new, the way all of them were simply new, an entire row of identical, untouched material that existed only to be used once and then thrown away without a second thought. The morphine came next, and it puzzled her in a different way. Individual syrettes, small collapsible tubes with a needle already attached, each one pre-measured, sealed, ready to be used by a single soldier on himself or a wounded comrade with almost no training required at all. Her own side's pain relief, when it existed at all, was precious and carefully guarded, administered by trained personnel who understood exactly how much a given patient could safely receive, because the supply was too limited to waste on anything but the most careful, deliberate use. Here was pain relief distributed so widely and so casually that an ordinary soldier was trusted to carry it and use it on himself, in a design that assumed the occasional wasted or misused syrette was an acceptable cost of making sure no wounded man went without it. The third thing she found was smaller, and in some ways more revealing than either of the others. Spare gauze, far more than the wound in front of her could plausibly require, packed in quantities that suggested nobody had ever needed to think carefully about exactly how much a single patient might use. In Hoa's practice, gauze was measured out with real precision because using too much on one patient meant having too little for the next. The quantity packed into this single bag suggested an entirely different relationship to the material. Not careful measurement against a limited total supply, but simple, generous excess, provided because providing enough for every plausible need was simply easier than calculating the exact minimum required. There was a fourth thing, smaller still, that she almost missed entirely. Tucked into a side pocket she nearly overlooked. A small tin of the foot powder, unrelated to any battlefield wound at all, included simply because someone, somewhere in a supply depot far from any fighting, had decided a soldier's comfort in the jungle was worth a few extra ounces of weight in every medic's bag. Hoa turned the tin over in her hands longer than its contents deserved because it told her something the more dramatic items had not quite managed to. This was not an army equipping its medics for catastrophe alone. It was an army that could afford to think about blisters, about comfort, about the 1,000 small miseries of a soldier's daily life that had nothing to do with survival because the larger, more urgent needs had already been so thoroughly and generously met that there was room left over to think about anything else at all. Understanding what Hoa was actually looking at requires connecting these individual items to the broader system that produced them, because the bag itself was not really the point. It was physical evidence of an entire philosophy of medical care that had nothing in common with the one she had been trained in. The American approach to combat medicine, reflected in every item inside that bag, assumed that the correct response to uncertainty was to provide generously rather than ration carefully. You did not know exactly how severe a wound might be or exactly how much dressing it might require, so you carried enough to handle the worst plausible case. You accepted that most of the time you would use less than you carried, because the cost of carrying too much was trivial compared to the cost of carrying too little at the moment it actually mattered. This was, in its own way, a coherent and rational philosophy of medicine, but it was a philosophy that only made sense for an army with a supply chain capable of replacing that generous excess as quickly as it was consumed, indefinitely, for as long as the war required. Hoa's approach, forced on her by circumstance rather than chosen as a philosophy, ran in the opposite direction entirely. Every decision she made assumed that whatever she used today might not be replaced tomorrow, and that assumption shaped everything from how much dressing she applied to a wound to how carefully she rationed pain relief among patients who all needed it badly. This was not a lesser form of medicine, and it is important to say that plainly. It represented extraordinary skill, patience, and resourcefulness, achieving real results with a fraction of the material an American medic would have considered a bare minimum. Picture the two triage scenes side by side, because the contrast is the whole story. An American medic treating a wounded man in a firefight opens a fresh dressing, applies it generously, and reaches for another without hesitation if the first is not enough, trusting entirely that his bag or the next resupply will cover whatever he uses today. Hoa treating a comparable wound in the same kind of chaos makes a different set of calculations in the same span of seconds. How much can this wound actually spare from what remains in her kit? Whether the man in front of her needs this dressing more than the man she has not yet reached. Whether there will be anything left at all by the time she finishes her rounds that night. Same wound, same urgency, two entirely different worlds governing the hands doing the work. Picture two, what happened after the wound was treated on each side, because the aftermath revealed the gap just as clearly as the treatment itself. An American medic, having used what he needed, moved on to the next task without a backward glance at the depleted supply, confident that the next resupply run would restore whatever he had spent. Hoa, having used what she needed, immediately began the mental accounting of what remained, what could be stretched further, what patient coming next might now have to make do with less because of what this one had required. The American medic's certainty was itself a kind of luxury Hoa had never once experienced in her entire career, the simple, unremarkable confidence that tomorrow would bring more of everything he might need. A confidence built on a supply chain so reliable that its reliability had become invisible to the men who depended on it. It would be incomplete to treat the contents of that bag as simple, uncomplicated superiority, because the honest history of medicine in that war includes real limits to what American material abundance could actually accomplish. Material abundance in individual equipment did not, by itself, guarantee better medical outcomes in every circumstance. The practical realities of combat frequently narrowed the gap between what a well-supplied medic could theoretically do and what he could actually accomplish under fire. A medic pinned down in a firefight, however well-stocked his bag, faced many of the same brutal constraints Hoa faced: limited time, limited light, a wounded man whose condition might be beyond what any amount of dressing and morphine could fix before more advanced care arrived. Abundance of supply did not eliminate the fundamental difficulty of practicing medicine in combat. It simply changed which specific constraints mattered most. Picture an American medic in exactly this position, because it complicates the simple story his well-stocked bag might otherwise tell. He has everything he needs physically: dressings, morphine, plasma expander, all of it within reach, but the position is under fire, and the wounded man in front of him needs surgery his bag cannot provide, and the helicopter that would carry him to that surgery cannot land in the middle of an active firefight. The medic does exactly what his kit allows him to do, and it is genuinely more than Hoa could have done with her own supplies in the same moment. But it is not enough, because the thing the wounded man actually needed was not in any bag at all. It was time and a landing zone and a surgeon, none of which a well-stocked kit could manufacture on its own. And there is a further honest reckoning worth making, connected to a story we have told elsewhere in the series about what actually determined whether wounded men survived. The evacuation system behind that bag, the helicopters, the forward hospitals, the whole invisible machine that got wounded Americans to definitive care within the crucial early hours mattered enormously more to survival outcomes than the specific contents of any individual medic's bag. A generously stocked aid kit, used by a skilled medic who could not get his patient to a surgeon in time, faced the same hard limits Hoa faced with her own patients. The bag Hoa examined was real evidence of genuine material wealth, but it was only one piece of a much larger system. This matters because it keeps the story honest about what Hoa's side actually achieved despite lacking any comparable material abundance. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong medical personnel, working with a fraction of the supply available to their American counterparts, still managed to treat enormous numbers of wounded soldiers, developing genuine expertise and genuine ingenuity that deserves to be remembered on its own terms, not merely as a poorer version of American practice. The bag Hoa held represented real advantages, and those advantages were real and significant. It did not represent the entire difference between the two sides' medical care. Hoa carried the memory of that bag with her for years afterward, and the understanding that eventually formed was more complicated and more useful than a simple recognition of American wealth would have been on its own. She came to understand that the abundance she had witnessed reflected something much larger than generosity toward wounded soldiers, though the individual soldiers who benefited from it certainly experienced it as exactly that. It reflected an entire nation's industrial and economic capacity, channeled into supporting a war fought on the other side of the world at a scale that treated the equipping of an individual medic's bag as a trivial line item within an almost incomprehensibly larger effort. The dressings, the morphine, the gauze, none of it existed because anyone had decided medicine specifically deserved special generosity. It existed because the entire American war effort operated on an assumption of abundance that touched every category of material, simply because the underlying economic and industrial capacity made that abundance possible across the board. This connected in her mind to something she had already begun to understand about the war more broadly, the same lesson we have seen other men and women in this series arrive at from different starting points. Her side could not match this kind of abundance in medicine or in anything else, and it had wisely stopped trying to match it directly. Instead, it built its entire approach around a different currency entirely: endurance, patience, the willingness to achieve results with less, sustained for years longer than a wealthier opponent's political patience for the war itself was ultimately willing to last. The bag she held represented an advantage her side could not answer with more supplies of their own. It could only be answered by outlasting the war that had produced it. She remembered reporting the contents of that bag to her commanding officer, an experienced man who had fought through the war against the French and had his own long history of making do with almost nothing. He listened to her inventory without much visible reaction, the way a man listens to a fact he has already half suspected but never had confirmed so precisely. When she finished, he said something she carried with her for the rest of her career. It did not matter how much they carried in their bags, he told her, if the war outlasted their willingness to keep carrying it. He was not dismissing what she had found. He was placing it inside a larger calculation that his own years of fighting had taught him to trust more than any single measure of material wealth. She thought, too, about what this meant for her own daily practice in the months and years after that discovery. She did not become bitter about the gap, and she did not stop practicing the careful, disciplined medicine that scarcity had taught her, because that discipline remained exactly as necessary as it had always been. But she carried, from that day forward, a clearer understanding of exactly what she was working against. Her own careful, resourceful practice was not simply a lesser substitute for what the other side had. It was a genuinely different approach to medicine, forged by circumstances the other side never had to face, and it had kept alive a great many patients that circumstance alone should have doomed. She noticed, in the months after that discovery, a subtle shift in how she carried herself at work, though it took her some time to name it precisely. She had always practiced her rationing with a kind of quiet shame underneath the competence, a private sense that she was doing a lesser version of real medicine because she lacked the tools to do it properly. That shame began slowly to give way to something closer to pride. She was not failing to practice real medicine. She was practicing an entirely legitimate and demanding discipline of her own, one that asked more of her judgment and her resourcefulness than an abundantly supplied practice ever would have required. And she had been doing it successfully for years without ever fully crediting herself for the achievement it actually represented. Hua survived the war and continued practicing medicine for decades afterward, in conditions that slowly, gradually improved as her country rebuilt. She thought often, across those years, about the specific afternoon she opened that captured bag and about what it had actually taught her. She came to see that single bag as one of the clearest lessons she had ever received about the actual shape of the war she had fought, delivered not through any battle or any casualty, but through the simple contents of a piece of canvas luggage. She had spent years treating patients with almost nothing, and she had assumed in some unexamined way that this reflected something about the nature of medicine itself under wartime conditions. That scarcity was simply what war did to medical care, everywhere, for everyone. The bag taught her that this was not true. Scarcity was not an inevitable feature of wartime medicine. It was a specific condition produced by a specific set of circumstances that had never applied to the men on the other side of that conflict at all. She tried once, years later, to explain the discovery to a younger colleague who had trained under better conditions, well-supplied hospitals with equipment she herself had never once had access to during the war. She described the wrapper, the syrette, the excess gauze, and watched the younger woman struggle to understand why any of it had mattered so much. To her, sterile dressings and adequate pain relief were simply what medicine was supposed to look like, unremarkable facts of a properly equipped hospital. Hoa understood, watching that blank incomprehension, that she was describing an experience the next generation would never have to feel for themselves. And there was something bittersweet in that, a grief for her own younger self, alongside genuine relief that the gap she had once measured with her own hands was finally closing for the medics who came after her. She tried a different approach the second time she told the story, years later still, to a room of trainee medics at a modest but improving hospital. She did not describe the wrapper or the syrette in detail this time. She simply asked them to imagine never once worrying for their entire career whether they had enough. Most of the young faces in that room could not fully imagine it because the shortages of her own war were already becoming history to them rather than memory. A few of the older instructors in the back of the room, men and women who had lived through what she had lived through, exchanged a look she recognized instantly. It was the look of people who understood exactly what she meant, because they had once measured it too, in their own hands, on their own worst days. And she came, in her final understanding, to a settled clarity about what that capture bag had and had not actually revealed. It had revealed real, staggering material wealth channeled into keeping individual wounded soldiers alive at a scale her own side could not begin to match. It had not revealed a medicine practiced with more skill or more genuine care for the patient in front of the medic holding it, because skill and care she had learned across years of her own difficult practice were never simply functions of how much material a medic had available to spend. They were functions of the person doing the work, and on that measure, she had never once believed her own side had anything to be ashamed of. Here is what Hoa finally understood, holding that captured bag in her hands, and why it mattered more than one afternoon of astonishment on a dirt floor. She had expected to find a slightly better version of her own equipment, and instead, she found an entirely different relationship to medical material, one built around an abundance so complete that waste itself had become an acceptable, unremarkable cost of doing business. Every individually wrapped dressing, every pre-measured syrette, every excess roll of gauze told the same story from a different angle. This was not simply more supplies. It was proof of an entirely different economic and industrial reality standing behind the war, one capable of treating the equipping of a single medic's bag as a trivial expense within an almost unimaginably larger effort. And the deepest lesson in that bag was not really about medicine at all, and it is a lesson that reaches well beyond one field hospital in one war. Material abundance can transform what individual care looks like, making generosity and excess the default rather than the exception, and that transformation is real, and it matters enormously to the people who benefit from it. But abundance does not, by itself, determine who practices medicine with more skill or more genuine devotion to the patient in front of them, because those things were never a function of supply in the first place. Hoa treated patients with almost nothing for years, and she saved a great many of them, using exactly the same fundamental skill and care that any well-supplied medic brought to the same work. The gap between her bag and the one she examined that day was real, and it was enormous, and it never once determined which side of that gap actually cared more about the people bleeding in front of them. There is a lesson in that worth holding on to far past one bag in one war. It is tempting, looking at any gap in resources between two people or two institutions doing the same work, to assume the better supplied side must also be doing the better work. Sometimes that is true, often it is not. Skill, judgment, and genuine care for another human being are not manufactured in a factory and shipped in a canvas bag. They are built in a person through years of doing hard work with whatever happens to be available. And a person who has done that work with almost nothing has often built something no supply chain could ever provide on its own. Hoa opened that bag expecting bandages and found an entire economy compressed into a piece of canvas luggage, more medical material than her hospital sometimes held for an entire week, carried casually on the back of a single man who had likely never once had to think carefully about whether he had enough. She never stopped being astonished by what that bag represented, and she never once mistook that astonishment for a judgment about her own worth as a medic, because she understood, better than almost anyone, that the hands doing the healing mattered as much as anything sitting inside the bag they carried. That is what stunned NVA medics examining a captured American Medevac kit. Not just the bandages, the whole vast, unequal world standing behind them, and the quiet, hard-won knowledge that the world behind the bag was never the same thing as the skill and care of the person holding it. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, material differences that shaped who survived and who did not on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a medic, a corpsman, a nurse, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and women carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten